What happens when a royal who has carefully curated his post-palace image finally comes face to face with a journalist who refuses to play along? This wasn't just another celebrity interview. This was a collision course. Prince Harry versus George Stephanopoulos. And the studio was about to witness sparks that would ignite live on air. The Good Morning America studio hummed with its usual pre-show electricity. Camera operators slid into position, floor managers waved frantic hand signals, and the glowing red tally lights above the lenses flickered on one by one. The air smelled faintly of makeup powder and fresh coffee, the nervous energy of early morning television hanging heavy. The studio audience whispered in anticipation, clutching their cue cards that read, "Applause and reaction." They weren't just here for morning television. They were about to be part of a cultural moment. At the center of it all sat George Stephanopoulos, calm, sharp. Years of political interviews had carved his reputation into something unshakable. He shuffled his note cards with surgical precision, eyes flicking once toward the cameras, then back to his guest. Across from him, Prince Harry leaned back in a sleek chair, legs crossed, navy suit pressed to perfection. He exuded confidence, even comfort, the smile of a man who believed he was about to glide through another sympathetic conversation about charity, family, and his truth. The lights dimmed slightly. The countdown began. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. "Good morning," George began smoothly, his tone professional, yet edged with intent. "Today, we're joined by Prince Harry, here to talk about his advocacy work in upcoming projects. Your Royal Highness, thank you for being here." "Pleasure to be here, George," Harry replied, flashing the polished grin he had worn through countless interviews. The audience applauded on cue, and for a moment everything felt routine. But George hadn't spent weeks preparing for routine. He leaned forward, his first card still untouched, his eyes locked onto Harry's. "I want to begin with something our viewers have been asking again and again. You've spoken at length about wanting privacy. Yet in recent years, you have done a Netflix documentary, multiple primetime interviews, and now another memoir. How do you reconcile the call for privacy with this level of public exposure?" The first fissure appeared in Harry's expression. His lips curved into a smile, but his eyes flickered. "Well, George, there's a difference between my privacy being invaded and me choosing to share my truth. When I speak out, it's about issues that matter. It's on my terms." "On your terms," George repeated, his voice cutting like glass. The phrase lingered in the studio, heavier than it seemed. "But is it really about the issues or about controlling the narrative? Because to many, it looks like you want privacy when it shields you and publicity when it benefits you." The audience shifted uncomfortably. Even through the cameras, tension radiated. Harry straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening. "That's not fair. Everything I've said, every interview I've done, has been about causes I believe in. Mental health, veterans, equality. I've used my platform to make a difference." George didn't flinch. He had heard rehearsed lines before. "Causes you believe in, yes. But let's be honest, Prince Harry. Your words have also come with accusations. You've spoken about betrayals, racism, neglect. You've written about private family moments. These statements have hurt people who cannot or will not respond publicly. Do you ever consider their side of the story?" Harry blinked rapidly, caught off guard by the directness. His fingers tightened on the armrest, his practiced composure beginning to slip. "My family has had decades to use the British press to tell their version. They've had courtiers, headlines, institutions protecting them. I had nothing. I had to speak." "But isn't that selective?" George pressed, leaning forward now, the energy of the room turning from polite to confrontational. "You say you wanted protection, yet you've profited from exposing the very people you claim harmed you. You say you wanted peace, yet you've signed multi-million-dollar contracts that depend on keeping the drama alive. Where is the line between advocacy and exploitation?" A collective gasp rippled through the audience. The producers in the control room leaned in toward their monitors. This was no softball interview. Harry's face flushed a deep red. "That's not exploitation, it's survival. We had no choice. We had to support ourselves after leaving the institution." We had to secure our future. George's eyes narrowed. His voice was steady, but the words struck like a hammer. Survival? Your father provided financial support after you stepped back. Your grandmother left you an inheritance. You were not destitute. So tell us, was it survival or was it ambition? The silence that followed was deafening. Harry's lips parted, but no words came. The camera zoomed closer, catching every flicker of emotion. The frustration, the disbelief, the panic creeping at the edges of his royal calm. Viewers at home didn't just see a prince, they saw a man cornered. And for the first time in a long time, Prince Harry looked like he might not have an answer. The silence in the studio was unbearable. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not a whisper from the audience. Every camera locked in tighter on Prince Harry's face. Every microphone angled forward as though the equipment itself wanted to capture his next breath. He had been through combat zones, walked behind his mother's coffin before millions, stood in front of roaring crowds. Yet somehow, this quiet moment under the lights of an American morning show felt far more threatening. George Stephanopoulos leaned back slightly, folding his hands, his gaze unwavering. He didn't need to raise his voice. His restraint was the power. Prince Harry, he said evenly, when you speak of survival, it sounds dramatic, almost cinematic. But viewers aren't seeing a man who was left destitute. They're seeing a man with book deals, Netflix contracts, and streaming specials. They're asking, survival from what, exactly? Harry's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his hands gripping the chair arms tighter. His media training whispered in his ear, pivot, redirect, smile. He forced a breath. George, survival isn't only financial. It's emotional, it's mental. We were suffocated by lies, by constant attacks on my wife. The palace refused to defend us. That silence was killing us slowly. Stephanopoulos' eyebrows twitched just slightly, the closest he came to skepticism on live television. Silence or discretion? Your family has largely refrained from answering your public accusations, even when those accusations painted them as cold, manipulative, even racist. Do you see silence as complicity or simply dignity? The audience murmured, a ripple of agreement with the sharpness of the question. Harry's eyes darted toward them, then back to George. Dignity? Harry's voice rose a notch, defensive. Dignity would be telling the truth. Dignity would be standing up for what's right. Instead, they let the press destroy us. They left us to rot. Or, George countered smoothly, they chose not to drag their family's private matters onto television stages. They chose not to write books. They chose not to call international networks every time a headline upset them. Doesn't dignity sometimes mean staying silent, even when it hurts? Harry's jaw clenched. He looked down briefly, then back up, his cheeks burning. Easy for you to say, George. You didn't live it. You didn't watch your wife sob on the floor because she couldn't handle the pressure. You didn't have tabloids stalking your every move, twisting every word. The studio held its breath. George leaned in, his voice quieter now, but sharper than ever. But is every negative story a lie? Is every criticism racism? Or is that your shield against accountability? Because when I look at the record, many of the so-called lies were simply unflattering truths. Your decisions, your actions. Las Vegas, the costume, the interviews timed during family crises. Did the press invent those moments, or did you give them the material? Harry froze, his knuckles white against the armrest. The audience gasped. For the first time, his practiced charm seemed to crumble. He opened his mouth, but his voice cracked on the first word. Those were mistakes. I've said that before. I've apologized, but they don't define who I am today. George didn't smile. He didn't nod. He pressed on. Then let's talk about today, about decisions in recent years. The Oprah interview airing while your grandfather was hospitalized. The Netflix series debuting during the mourning period for your grandmother. Did you consider how those choices might have compounded the pain of your own family? Harry's eyes widened, his breath catching audibly in the microphone. We had contracts, George, obligations. These projects were years in the making. It wasn't so simple. Contracts, George repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. So your contractual obligations outweighed your family's grief. That is what millions heard. Is that really the message you want to send? The audience's murmurs grew louder now, a mix of shock and disbelief. Even the producers in the control room exchanged glances, realizing the tension had reached a boiling point. Harry leaned forward suddenly, his voice trembling with anger. You're twisting my words. You're doing exactly what the British press did, taking everything out of context. I came here to talk about charity, about mental health, and instead you're interrogating me like a criminal. Stephanopoulos didn't move. His voice was calm, almost soothing, but the content was devastating. No one is treating you like a criminal, Your Highness, but you are a public figure. You've made accusations. You've profited from those accusations. The public has every right to question whether they were justified. Harry's breathing quickened, audible through the lapel microphone. His polished facade was gone now, replaced with raw emotion. The camera zoomed closer, capturing every flicker of desperation in his eyes. And then Stephanopoulos asked the question that turned the studio ice cold. Do you ever take responsibility for anything that has gone wrong in your life? Or is it always someone else's fault? The words hung in the air like thunder. The audience gasped audibly. Producers froze. Camera operators exchanged wide-eyed looks. And Prince Harry said nothing. For the first time, the silence wasn't George's weapon. It was Harry's collapse. The silence after George Stephanopoulos' question was suffocating. Do you ever take responsibility, or is it always someone else's fault? It echoed through the studio like a challenge too heavy to ignore. The audience leaned forward in their seats. The producers in the control room froze, and the camera zoomed in mercilessly on Harry's face. For several long seconds, Prince Harry sat motionless. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. His eyes darted left, then right, searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. Every breath he took seemed amplified by the studio microphones, each inhale and exhale betraying the storm raging inside him. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, shaky. Of course, I take responsibility. I took responsibility when I served in Afghanistan. I took responsibility when I left the UK to protect my family. I've carried more weight than you'll ever understand. The words were meant to sound strong, but they trembled with defensiveness. Stephanopoulos leaned in, his tone calm yet unyielding. Those are broad strokes, Prince Harry, major life choices framed as noble sacrifices. But I'm asking about the smaller moments, the contradictions, the things that don't add up. You talk about survival, yet you lived in luxury. You talk about truth, yet your stories keep shifting. You claim abandonment, yet your family supported you financially long after you stepped down. Which version is the truth? The prince's face flushed crimson. His jaw clenched, his hands shot up to run through his hair. A nervous tick he tried to suppress but couldn't hide. It's complicated, he snapped. Life isn't black and white, George. You sit there and pretend everything has a neat explanation, but you didn't live it. You don't know the pressure, the grief, the constant attacks. George's expression didn't waver. His voice dropped lower, colder. But isn't that the reality of every public figure? The scrutiny, the headlines, the criticism? Why should you and your wife be immune? Why should every negative story be dismissed as racism or lies? At what point do you accept that some of it is simply consequence of your own words, your own actions? A gasp rippled through the audience. Harry's hands tightened on the chair so fiercely his knuckles whitened. His voice rose, strained, almost breaking. Because it wasn't just consequence, it was harassment, it was cruelty, it was racism, whether you want to admit it or not. George didn't raise his voice, but his next question cut sharper than any shout. Then name one instance, one specific example with facts, names, dates. If you're going to make accusations that damage reputations, don't you owe the public clarity? Harry's eyes flickered wildly. His mouth opened, but no answer came. His silence spoke louder than words ever could. The audience sat frozen, the atmosphere thick with disbelief. Finally, Harry pushed back in his chair, his voice trembling with anger. I don't owe anyone anything. I've given enough of my life to the public. Enough! The words landed like a slap, but George was unmoved. "And yet here you are," he replied, steady as steel, "on national television, promoting another book, another project, another narrative. If you don't owe the public anything, why keep selling them your truth?" The prince's composure shattered. He stood abruptly, the scrape of his chair against the floor shrieking through the studio. Gasps erupted from the audience as he glared down at Stephanopoulos. "This interview is over." Camera operators instinctively followed him as he turned, but Stephanopoulos' calm voice stopped him mid-step. "Walking away now will only prove my point, that when challenged, you have no answers." The words froze Harry in place. For a moment, his back was to the cameras, shoulders heaving with frustration. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, watching history unfold. Slowly, shakily, he turned back and lowered himself into the chair. His royal facade was gone. What remained was a man cornered, exposed, stripped of control. His voice was barely a whisper. "I just wanted to protect my wife, my children. That's all I ever wanted." George leaned back, his expression unreadable, his tone softer now but still firm. "And that's admirable, but perhaps protecting them doesn't require destroying everyone else." The final words hung in the air like a verdict. Harry's eyes glistened with unshed tears. He didn't speak again. The cameras captured the moment, a broken silence, a fallen posture, a prince humbled in front of millions. When the segment ended, the audience erupted, not in applause but in a low, stunned murmur. Stephanopoulos gathered his cards calmly, his composure unshaken. Harry rose wordlessly, avoiding eye contact, and left the stage without the customary handshake. Viewers around the world sat glued to their screens, replaying every piercing question, every pause, every flash of emotion. For many, it was the first time they had seen Prince Harry not as a victim or a rebel, but as a man who had finally run out of defenses. And in that moment, one truth was undeniable. George Stephanopoulos hadn't backed down, and Prince Harry had crumbled. Live before all the cameras.